our study of Christian stewardship. Let's go over to Matthew chapter 5. Probably be Luke, but I think we did Matthew already. Matthew chapter 5. We're studying in this last paragraph of Christian stewardship, we're studying about tithing, and we've studied in the Old Testament kind of the roots and the foundation of tithing and the purpose for it and the reason for it, and then we've transferred over to the national tithe of Israel, giving the examples of how they used the tithe to sustain the priesthood and how they used the tithe to sustain the temple of the Lord, and also for wherever God put his name, or he would have a for lack of a better word, a synagogue or a local church or a local place that a Levite would be organized, and people would send their tithes to the Levite in their local area, and then he would send it to the temple in heaven, not in heaven, but in Jerusalem. So some people might think Jerusalem's heaven, but I don't know about that. Some theology going on there. But anyway, Matthew chapter 5, 22 through 24. Okay, we already did that. I see that now. That was about leaving if you have a problem against your brother, to leave it at the altar. Let's go ahead and go to Luke chapter 11. That's where I wanted to go. Matthew, Mark, Luke. Luke chapter 11. So we're transitioning. Remember, the Gospels are a transition. It's still Old Testament technically until the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, which ushered into the New Testament, which starts in power and Acts with the church. And so effectively, I would say, because that's where people start converting from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And so here in the Gospels, Jesus is establishing the fact that the Pharisees and the Jews, remember previously the problem with the Israelites was that they were a fleshly people. They were stiff-necked and arrogant, and then they would seek after other gods, and then they would not be giving their tithe. They would rob God of their tithes and offerings, and they weren't doing the outward things that their covenant commanded of them. As a nation, they weren't doing those things. They kind of fell away, and Malachi was rebuking them. You've robbed God in your tithes and your offerings, your actual money and your actual fruit and stuff, and you're forsaking the widow. You were forsaking the Levite. And in Jesus' time, there's Maccabees and all this stuff, and the history is all going in there, is that they reformed the people, and because they lost their nation as their kings and stuff, they transformed into kind of like a displaced people, and then they transformed from a nation to kind of like a religion, to where they reformed the Old Testament practices. They got rid of or they thought they got rid of their idols and things like that, and that they started doing the law. They were very meticulous about doing the law, where they would tithe their mint and their anise, and they would do all these things. But Jesus, remember when we last talked about it, that Jesus corrected them that they would oftentimes tithe with their mint and anise, but they would forsake the weightier things of the law, the spiritual things. So they finally figured out, hey, we ought to be doing these outward expressions of the law, but then they were doing them without the right spirit. They were doing them without judgment and mercy and thankfulness, the things that the purpose of the tithe was to develop and get the people to have mercy and justice and so forth. And that's what the purpose of the salt and light of Christianity is supposed to do to a nation, is to reform it and to make it a godly nation as a whole. Even if the people there are not godly, that the nation itself can be preserved through the salt and light of those individuals. But the problem with the Pharisees was that they were doing the outward things without developing and enhancing the reason for those outward things. Why do you tithe? It's so that you can spread the gospel, you can spread Christianity, you can spread the ministry of the word, if you will, to the nation that you're in, and especially as Christians, we do it to propagate the Great Commission in particular. But the Old Testament and the Jewish man at this time, of Jesus' time, was supposed to do it so that they could do these for their people and for the people that they were interacted with. But if you just give money to an organization that isn't doing anything, then you're just putting money in a bank account. It's not doing anything. There's no purpose to the tithe. And so that was the problem with the Jews of Jesus' time. They were putting money into the temple, but the temple was setting up shop for sheep and goats and stuff so that they could sell and make profit off of people doing the rituals. This is where your ceremonial rituals come in, where it means nothing except for the act of doing it. And they weren't actually doing anything spiritual. They were just in a money-making scheme with the whole outward show of tithing and animals and such. Here in Luke chapter 5, verses 22 through 24, it says, "But when Jesus perceived that their thoughts, he answered and said," is that right? No, Luke chapter 11, I'm sorry. I'm getting my books mixed up. Luke chapter 11. Luke chapter 11, verse 42. It says, let's go to 39. And the Lord said unto him, "Now do ye Pharisees make clean the outside of the cup and the platter?" See, they were doing the outside rituals, but your inward parts is full of ravening wickedness. You know, what is the tithe supposed to do? It's supposed to benefit the spiritual, to get the spiritual from one person to the other, and to enhance and glorify God. But all it's doing, because the inside is full of ravening wickedness, then the tithe is just basically a tithe for ravening wickedness. You know, it's not beneficial for anything. So they had, their inward heart was still the same as the people that were robbing God in Malachi, except the difference between the people in Malachi robbing God was that the wicked people in Malachi were wicked inward and outward, and the Reformed Jew, who was in Jesus' day, they were wicked inward but washed outward. You see, they were hypocrites. They had double standards. They did the outward signs of the law, but they didn't do what was meant. The law was meant to enhance the inward heart, the spiritual. It says, "But your inward part is full of ravening wickedness. Ye fools, did not he that made that which is without make that which is within also?" So you're saying, "Oh, I'm following the Lord outwardly, and then in secret I can do whatever I want." You're a fool, because he made the outward part to be obedient to the Lord, and you're doing that. But on the inward heart, which God made also, because he fashioned you in the womb, both physically and spiritually, and yet on the outward part you think it's good that you're serving the Lord when your heart is filled with wickedness. How does that benefit you? He made that which is within also. Verse 41, "But rather give alms in such things as ye have, and behold, all things are clean unto you. But woe unto you, Pharisees, for ye tithe the mint and rue, and all manner of herbs, and pass over judgment and the love of God. These ought ye have done, and not to leave the other undone." What Jesus is saying is that, yes, tithing is important. It's not, and then a lot of times Christians in today, they get it flip-flop from the Pharisees. Is that they, on the inward, they are somewhat spiritual. They think the spiritual is important, and they think, oh yeah, I need to serve the Lord with my heart. I need to love the Lord very much. And they're busy reading their Bible. They're busy trying to be morally good people. But then they say, oh, but these outward things like tithing and stuff, that was all Old Testament. All the outward stuff is all Old Testament. You know, it doesn't matter how I treat my fellow man. I can learn 35 chapters of the Bible in a year and memorize it all completely, and that's what I need to do because I'm reforming my heart. But then to speak nicely to my brother or my sister, or to have mercy outwardly to them, is not necessary, because they need to be conformed to the Word of God. And if they're off just a little bit, then I don't need to associate with them. It's like they have no love for their fellow man because they think they're reforming their inward heart so much. It's not like one or the other is more important, but Christ is saying you have to have both. You need to, yes, is it good to memorize? Like if you can memorize 35 chapters a year or more, and things, those are great things, but you need to apply what you learn. You need to be able to have the inward and the outward both together. That is what Jesus Christ is saying. Too often times people say, well, the Pharisees, they focus on that outward stuff. Well, Jesus said the outward stuff didn't matter. It's what's on the heart. No, it's what's on the heart comes out of the mouth. And so it's both. But woe unto you, Pharisees, for ye tithe the mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass over judgment, love of God. These ought ye have done, and not to leave the other undone. See, they're both. Woe unto you, Pharisees, for you love the uppermost seats in the synagogue, and greetings in the market. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. They're all about outward show. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are as graves which appear not, and men as that walk over them, not aware of them. And so we need to understand that, yes, we as Christians kind of have this flip-flop where we know it's important to work on the inward heart, but to show forth mercy and love and truth and to do the outward things of tithing, we're like, oh, well, that's regulated to the Old Testament. It doesn't matter anymore. And in one sense, it doesn't, but the thing is that we do these things out of the desire of our heart because we desire to see the gospel propagated and so forth. And so let's go ahead and go to Luke chapter 18, verse 12. Luke chapter 18, verse 12. See, the inward and the outward, like Christ said, is made by God. We have to conform both the heart and the outward actions to the Lord. Luke chapter 18, verse 12. Now, this is the picture of the sinner and the saints, supposedly, in Judaism. Verse 9, he says, and he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves, and that they were righteous and despised others. And then here's this parable. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. The one was a Pharisee, and the other a publican. Outwardly, a Pharisee is the most perfect supposed Jew ever. We can consider this the outward most perfect Christian you can ever have, or even today, the inward most perfect Christian you could ever think of. Oh, they read their Bible, 45 minutes morning and night at a time, and they pray 27 hours a day and without ceasing, so it's like, I don't know where that math is coming from, but anyway, See, the reason why they can do 27 hours a day is because they're double-minded and unsettled all the way. But anyway, 2 men went up into the temple to pray. The one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, idolaters, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up his head so much as his eyes unto heaven. See, here's the Pharisee all looking up into heaven. Look at me. Oh, I'm so awesome. I'm so amazing. Oh, just make me weep about how great I am. And this publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful unto me, a sinner. See, the Pharisee had so much spiritual awareness about himself that he was so high and lifted up, and he's so happy that he's serving the Lord so greatly in his life, and and that he does all these great and wonderful deeds. The publican, knowing the wretchedness of his life, knowing the hardness of his job, a publican basically was the guy who was an advocate of the Roman government. He collected taxes. He made sure he was the policy enforcement officer. Anything going on in the government. You remember, technically the Roman government was a republic at the time, and so he was a Republican. And so we horrible Republicans, that's why we pray with our heads down. But anyway, I'm not a Republican. Oops, did I give away any politics? Anyway, so here we go. He's not respected in society. He is not one you would consider a great man of God. He is not one that you would consider that does a lot of things. In fact, the comparison and the implication is that this publican does not do all these great and wonderful things as this Pharisee. Just consider, to make the contrast greater, is that it's not like this publican has his job and he's attempting and trying to do these things that the Pharisee is doing, but rather that the publican doesn't do any of those things. He doesn't fast twice a week. He is quite probably, the Pharisee stood up and he said thus with himself, I think that I am not as other men are. See, he was a common man, the publican. He did a lot of the things that the common man did. He says, I am not as other men are, extortioners. Most likely, since he's pointing to this publican, this publican's probably been involved in extortion within last few, in the past. And particularly, the way that the publican got paid was to get a fee above and beyond what was required by the government to collect. And he had to make sure that not only did they pay their taxes, but they paid his fee as well. So he had to extort them. He had to make sure, he had to force them to pay what he felt they owed so that he could make a living. So basically, he did not have a respectable and just way of making a living. A farmer or a person there would work the land and get the fruits of his labor, but then a publican would be the type of person who not only got what he was supposed to collect, but also had to force out what he wanted to make out of every transaction. It was up to him. And so people felt that he was an extortioner. And it's like a lot of the Pharisees were kind of like were like taxation is theft and all this stuff, But it says he says extortioners, unjust. So they felt he was unjust. Adulterers. They felt that this guy was he's not an adulterer, or even as his publican. And then he fasts twice a week. This publican probably doesn't do that. I give tithes of all that I possess. The publican probably doesn't do that either. But the thing is that the publican, realizing that perhaps maybe doesn't do all those things, perhaps he has been an extortioner, he realizes these things have offended God, and so even though he's not doing them, he asks for mercy, and he would not lift up much of his eyes into heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful unto me, a sinner. This is a guy who does not know how to live perfect like the Pharisee. He can't do the outward parts because he doesn't know the outward parts. He's not well learned in the law or anything like that. But he knows that he's offended God, and so God be merciful unto me, a sinner. Verse 14, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased. If you're proud about your supposed spiritual life, if you're bragging that you're better than other people that are sinners, and you think maybe don't have this perfect life, or you don't that you think is lower than you, he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. We need to realize that, hey, we do these things not because we're proud of them or they get us some merit before God, but rather we want, like I said, we want to see God's things propagated, and this starts with our heart. It needs to be humble, it needs to be abased, it needs to be low. We need to humble ourselves and exalt Christ. And then of course, and so we understand the importance that if you're going to have one or the other, it's better that you humble yourself in heart, even if you don't know how to perfectly do the external. It's important to have that humble spirit, even if you are not perfect in doctrine, even if you're not perfect in actions, even if you're not perfect. And in fact, the publican, he is saying, I'm a sinner, which means he's fallen short completely of whatever God has set the standard at. I'm a sinner. I've fallen short of that. I have not kept the law. I have not done those things, and I need mercy. Basically, he broke the law, and God's saying, yes, you're okay with me. Your heart is right. You have a foundation to build on properly. And so we need to understand that when we give of our time, our talents, and our treasure, that it needs to be out of a humble heart, not out of I give more than other people, I'm better than other people because I do these things, and I'm more respectable. No, because the reason why this guy is doing this stuff, because he's looking at everybody else and measuring himself, whereas the publican is looking at God and measuring himself, and humbles himself. So let's look at, so we looked at basically the transition where Christ tells us it's not just one or the other, it's out of a grateful, humble heart that we do these things outwardly in expression of love, an expression of desire for the things of God to go out into the world. If you tithe and do all those things without having judgment and mercy and love of God, then the tithe won't propagate those things. You need to have the love of God first. You need to have the judgment and mercy first, and then when you tithe out of those things with your time, talent, treasure, then those things will propagate around the world. Because the things that you promote with material things is your spiritual heart that goes forth in those things. That's why the Bible talks about how that the unclean things can become clean and can be eaten and taken in when they are sanctified by the Word of God in prayer. It's because the idea is that the Spirit of God has an effect upon what you do outwardly. And so it needs to come, it should not be like, oh, I have it from within, but it's never going to come out, but rather it needs to come from within to without, and both need to be done, and not the other undone. So some of us are better at doing the outward expressions, and yet our heart is hardened and not merciful. Some of us have a wonderful heart, but we don't take the effort to propagate those ideals and so forth. And so Christ says, attempt to do both, but start from within, so that you have something to give with that. Okay, so we're done with this section. So of this idea of transition, making sure that the tithe starts from within with the spiritual, and then propagating out with the physical, and then we transition to the Old Testament to Jesus Christ and Christians with the tithe. So I have this labeled as priesthood transition from Jesus, because the priesthood originally is, in the Old Testament with the nation, is with the Levitical priesthood. It's with basically other nations have the Melchizedek priesthood, in the sense that, like Jethro had it, was a priest, and for Midian, and Melchizedek was a priest for the Amorites at that time, and then the priest of On was the priest over in Egypt. Joseph married his daughter and so forth. And so we need to understand that there was a priesthood in each nation that served the Lord, and eventually, of course, because they did serve the Lord from Moses, transitioning outward in each nation as they progressed from out of the Tower of Babel, they were following after the Lord, had a priest like Midian and so forth, and from Abraham. And they had those traditions. But eventually, of course, we see the lifestyle of these people. They all start dying off and stop and never replace their priesthood and so forth. But here in the New Testament, we learn, of course, that God has made Jesus a Melchizedek priest. And so he's taking over that, because the Melchizedek priest is not just a priest for a nation, they're a priest for the whole world. And to whoever comes to them, they were intercessors for for that person. And so it's just that Israel, with God's covenant with them, was to have a procedure to replace their priest. Remember, the Melchizedek priest was not done by birth and transitioned from son to father, and were taught, father taught son or something, but rather because of an oath, that person was made a priest to the Lord. And so while everybody else is dying out because they don't have an oath, they don't have a way to transition these things, and as they corrupt their nation and so forth, they pretty much became pagans and whatnot after a certain period of time. But Israel was able to, through the physical transition, to make sure that there was a way to have a priest, even if that priest perhaps was not a Christian or saved, that they would at least have the outward show to preserve the oracles and things that were there. And that's another subject to get that has more depth to it. But again, we're just trying to focus on the tithe. The priesthood transitioned to Jesus and Christians with the tithe, showing how that while even for these Jews in the New Testament who are part of the nation of Israel, after that nation is going to be destroyed in 70 AD, they lose their actual priesthood. There's no more transition. After 70 AD, when they get dispersed, they go back to because when they had their king and when they had the priesthood, and then all that was lost when the Babylonians took them over, and then they went to Babylon, they did not have a priesthood, and then it was basically the Jews transitioned to about synagogue and a rabbi system, and then when they were able to transition back under Ezra to the nation to have their priesthood restored, they had to go back into the roles, who's a Levite, who's all these things, and then they restored that priesthood for a temporary amount of time until the church propagated and started in that transition period. But then they lost that again, and they went back to the rabbinical and synagogue model without an actual priesthood. And so we as Christians understand and know that Jesus Christ basically took that over for the whole world. Just as they had previously lost the Melchizedek priesthood for a while, and the Levitical priesthood was the only legitimate priesthood to God for a while, then that, because they had rejected Christ as their leaders, like Caiaphas in the New Testament has rejected them, the only legitimate leftover priest to the Lord is Jesus Christ, and He's the head of all of it. And so the Levitical priesthood will not be restored until Christ returns and establishes that kingdom once again. And so we don't do, and of course the Old Testament, there were physical animals, and then Jesus had those ordinances that are physical and outward of the sacrificial system nailed to His cross, meaning that those sacrifices are done with in Christ, and that now the new priesthood does the same things as the priest, except they do it through prayer and prayers of praise and so forth. And again, as we study the nation of Israel, and as we study the New Testament, we're going to get into deeper aspects of that. But here, as far as the tithe, there is no priesthood for the Jews to tithe to. So Jewish Christians need to be tithing at their local church and so forth. But there's no. Yeah, so I don't want to get into that too much. So it's already 15 till, so we're going to go ahead and end there. Next time we discuss the tithe, we'll be discussing how that Christ is the priest that we as Christians need to be tithing towards, and how do we do that? Because in the nation of Israel, we know how they tithe. They tithe to the local Levite, and then the local Levite tithe to the temple, and so forth. So then does that mean Christianity should be set up like the Pope, where all the Catholic Church tithe to Rome? No. So we'll talk about that a little bit next week. Not next week, but in 2 weeks. And we will see how the new structure is set up. It's not set up like the Roman Catholic Church, but rather there's a different structure of how we are to pay our tithe to Jesus Christ. Okay, let's go ahead and dismiss in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lessons you give to us, Lord. I just pray that you'll continue to guide and help us. Help us to understand the importance of the tithe. Help us understand the importance of giving of our own selves, starting from within to without, that we not just pick and choose on the external or the internal, but rather we are a whole man, doing all things unto you, realizing that you created the outward and the inward of all people, the spiritual and the physical, that these things need to be conformed to you in all things. In Jesus' name I pray.